main reason why I don't work with men's stories is I am tired. I am tired as tired can be of men telling women's stories and telling us how to be over the
Yeah.
centuries and still today. And if a male storyteller tells a woman's story, then it rankles because, what do you know? You've caused most of the problems.
Sharon Blackie, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here with you.
Yeah, well, you have spoken to my wife. I think last year you guys did a podcast together about Haggitude.
Yeah, I think it was last year. I kind of old enough to be losing track of time these days.
hmm Yeah, so it's nice that I finally get a chance to talk to you as well. And I guess what inspired me to reach out again is you're teaching at one of my favorite places, Pacifica Graduate Institute, and I saw that you're teaching a course on narrative therapy and fairy tales. And I'm really intrigued by this. I haven't spoken to anyone on the podcast about narrative therapy, but and I don't know a whole lot about it myself. So I'd like to delve into that. Um, and I guess the question that was like popping up for me this morning was actually a question that Carl Jung asked, and he said it was the task of tasks to discover, to find out what was the myth he was living. And that's always been very intriguing to me. And I wonder if you agree with him.
I kind of do agree with him. So many years ago, 20 years ago, when I was practicing still as a psychotherapist, I developed a kind of unique narrative psychology practice, working with both myth and fairy tale. But the thing is, I do tend to think that for most of us, myth is a really hard thing to live up to. It's big. We're talking about gods, we're talking about the meaning of the world, and I tend to think that for most of us who don't have grandiosity, fairy tales are a little bit of a gentler way in. It's not to say that personal myth making is not important. I still use it in certain circumstances, but I think it's very much easier because fairy tales are a subset of folk tales, which are, by definition, the tales of the folk. They're about everyday life and the crises that you face. And it seems to me that it's just a little bit easier to see yourself or to find yourself in a fairy tale than it is to kind of embody a whole big mythic character. So that's why I prefer to work with fairy tales, least at the beginning, rather than going straight into myth.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting. I always took his statement to mean not necessarily to look into classical mythology and figure out what pattern closely matches ours, but that we should look at our life, read our life backwards, and try to find what is the story with meaning that we're living out. I mean, how do you take that?
I absolutely think that it is crucial, and the question only is where you find yourself. So we are narrative creatures. We all have a story of who we are and where we come from, and usually where we're going or where we want to go. And so it's very, very important to be able to look at your life in all of its phases as a narrative. And it's very important to be able to identify archetypal patterns in your life, and particularly patterns that you might be acting out again and again, and archetypal characters that you might be embodying or inviting into your life. Um, so I do think that it is very important, and it really is about the best way to write your story. So when I was practicing narrative therapy, the whole point was to try to get a client or a patient to see what story they had been living up until now and what story they actually wanted to live in the future, how they wanted to transform that story. And again, I understand what you're saying about classical mythology, but it is very, very difficult to see yourself as Athena, in your daily life. It's not that Athena is not an archetype that might be important to you. The whole wisdom and war thing might absolutely be there. But if you're looking at, okay, what are the steps in my life? What are the patterns in my life? Where am I going? The return, the separation, all of that kind of thing. It's very much easier for me to look at patterns and characters in fairy tales because they're very much closer to us. Athena didn't have a mother. Snow White did, and a stepmother. So if you have a mother wound, and looking at fairy tales, you can kind of find that character, where it's very, very difficult to do that in mythology. So if you're talking about myth, as I think Jung was, as a kind of overarching narrative word, that's terrific. But if you're looking at myth as, we have to find the specific myth that we're living, which a lot of that psychologists still do, I'm a little bit more cautious about that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement there. That's what I was getting at, that it's about like seeing your own life story as mythological rather than identifying with some mythological character. Yeah, like who you said tends to be
Indeed,
a.
but a lot of the ways that, there are lots of books on personal myth making, and a lot of them are about, or some of them at least are about identifying with a mythological character in order to think that you're living a myth. So I don't, we are in agreement. I just don't think that you necessarily need quite to do that.
Mhm. Yeah. So I guess your approach is more about telling your story and seeing it, like putting it in the same level of importance as a myth in a way, or a fairy story, like to give it value and to look for the meaning in it by identifying like archetypal patterns and things like that. Is that
Partly,
accurate? Mhm.
partly that's it. I think one of the main, um, one of the main benefits of using fairy tales, particularly, I'm just going to stick with that for now,
Mhm.
in a narrative approach, is that you can use, fairy tales are important and stay with us because of the very vivid imagery that's in them. And so you can use fairy tales to help people talk about things that they can't talk about, that they just can't name. You can talk about somebody losing their favorite purple dress as a metaphor for abuse. You can talk about the red shoes as a metaphor for addiction. So when people just don't really want to name it, or are not able to name it, or don't quite know what it is that they should be naming, the image driven power of fairy tales really helps them do that. So I used to quite often help people to rewrite their lives as a fairy tale, literally. So for me, once upon a time there was a princess, lived in the northeast of England, very, violent father. The king was very violent, the queen was um, not always present, just that kind of, it
Mm.
helps you to step back from it.
Mhm.
And it also really captures your imagination, and change is very much more possible when the imagination is captured. So there are lots and lots of different ways to work with fairy tales. But yes, it's really, for me, as much as anything, it's about image. It's about the image that stays with you, the Selkie skin, Every
Mm.
woman knows what that is. The
Mm.
image of the skin that's lost, that's been taken. So you don't need very much explanation. You just need the images. And fairy tales, often very much more than myths, are laden with these images, and that's why they stay with us. So they're incredibly powerful for transformation.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see where you're going. So it could involve me telling my life in a in a folk tale type way, once upon a time and all of that. And then also at the same time, I could be looking at other fairy tales and seeing which ones resonate with my life story. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so
Yeah.
okay.
Both of those. I mean, there are
Mhm.
lots and lots of things that you can do in this regard, but I do very much work with both of those approaches. And I've never come across anybody, even people who as children were not, or thought that they weren't particularly surrounded by fairy tales. Nevertheless, there's always something as an adult that captures them and just says, yeah, that kind of explains my life. And if you take Jung, well, certainly I've also been very influenced by James Hillman, who I know you know too. And Hillman's psychology is centered on the image and on the importance of the image, and the image in a way that doesn't require to be explained. The image does all the work. The image, carries all of the heavy weight, and that centrality of the image into the psyche is not just for me a theoretical thing. I used to see it every day in my psychotherapy practice, and I still see it every day now when I work with fairy tales on my Substack, for example. It's almost instant, and it is the image that I always encourage people to focus on. What image, what image is in this story as well as the characters, what image and the themes, what image in this story is really holding you. And then sit with the images, the whole Hillman-esque thing. Don't try to interpret it. Don't try to explain it. That takes the life out of the image, which certainly in my psychology has a life of its own, a process of becoming of its own. We treat it with respect. But just to sit with it, to work with it in various ways, to write about the image, to journal if you journal, to paint the image if you paint, to sew, to create, to find found objects in the land and create something around that image. There are so many ways that you can just gently allow that image to work on you. And
Hmm.
that's really the power for me of fairy tales.
Yeah. I guess in our kind of modern culture, there is always this proclivity toward problem solving. And so I want to use the fairy tale or the image to somehow sort out a psychological issue. And I think just staying with the image, sticking with the image, as Hillman would put it, requires some kind of faith that the image is going to affect you in some way, on a kind of a subconscious level, I suppose. Uh, so how do you think the images work on us?
Oh gosh, that's a very, very big question and a long answer, but I don't do long answers, so I'll try to make it brief. I absolutely subscribe to well, the easiestly identifiable philosophy is the Sufi philosophy, and Henri Corbin, who is a French philosopher, explained traditional Sufi philosophy and their idea that there was in between the physical world of our senses and the intellectual world, was another world, which he called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. That's a place where archetypes live, where stories live, where dreams happen to us, where synchronicities occur. And the whole point of this mundus imaginalis is it's quite as real as the physical world or any other world. But it's not, but it can only be accessed with the imagination, or what Henri Corbin called psychospiritual um, abilities.
Hmm.
And so my perspective, which is really kind of consistent with Hillman's, and Hillman was very, very much influenced by Henri Corbin, is that there is a world of images. The Plato would have called it the world soul, perhaps, or the world of forms and ideas. And I believe I'm not a traditional Jungian. I do not believe that the characters in fairy tales, or the characters in our dreams, or the characters anywhere else are aspects of the human psyche. That to me seems just a little bit kind of, really human centric, to put it politely. It's in and so I do,
Solipsistic.
yeah, exactly. I do very much believe that all of these images, all of these stories, the way that they combine, the way that they just demonstrate themselves, the archetypes and the different clothes they wear in different cultures and at different times in our lives, they have an independent existence. That's kind of, in a sense, the basis of the world. In our native traditions in Britain and Ireland, the concept of the other world was very similar to that whole idea of the mundus imaginalis. So, wherever you look, there is this idea of a world which is different, which you can kind of slip into, or which will happen to you. And it's full of kind of archetypal beings and archetypal patterns and ideas. So that's kind of where I think it's coming from, to be honest.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. I'm in total agreement with you, and it's so nice to speak with someone who I feel so aligned with, like philosophically, like, what is the imagination? And I'm right with you. It is the other world. It is the underworld. I've been calling the imagination because we've turned it into an object of sorts. So I've been saying it's a nation of images. It's another place where these archetypal images live and where we interact with them. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
and
Hellman
so,
would have called it the world of soul. That is
yeah,
soul. That's the world of psyche. Psyche is image,
yeah.
as you very famously said, or image is psyche, same thing. And that's where we understand who we are. So it's not that the physical world is not important; it's incredibly important. But there is this kind of imaginal overlay, I believe, of everything that we look at, everything that we hear, everything that we see. There's an imaginal overlay, and again, in the old Irish and British traditions, the other world wasn't a place you went to. It was absolutely entangled with this world. And every now and again, you could slip into it, you
Mm,
know, side of a river, or in mist, or, a threshold place. So that really does make a lot of sense to me.
hmm. Yeah. And even like, I don't know, instead of overlay, I'm thinking like underlay. Like
Mhm.
there's an old idea that the
Entanglement. Yeah.
entangle, yeah, but there's an old idea that the modus imaginalis gives birth actually to this world.
Mhm.
And so if we're thinking about how the images work on us through dreams, through sticking with the image, there's an effect happening maybe on that other level that will then have effects like rippling effects
Absolutely.
into our mundane existence, you know.
For sure.
Um,
I mean, in Irish tradition, and certainly I'm sure throughout Europe, it's just that we have older texts in Ireland, so we've seen it written down. The other world was the source of moral and spiritual authority. If you messed with the other world, if you didn't treat it with respect, the land would become a wasteland or it would be flooded. So absolutely, that was the source of kind of balance and centrality in the world.
Right, and part of that is like our job in this world is to feed the beings in the other world through ritual practice and things like that. Otherwise, they won't feed us, right?
Kind of depends very much on your tradition, I think. I mean, for
Hmm.
mostly in the traditions that I grew up with here in Britain and Ireland and Western Europe, it's not necessarily about ritual practice. It's just an appreciation. And there are many ways that you can show your appreciation for the other world. And it doesn't have to be anything kind of magical with a K. It can be just like, so I don't know. The example I always use, because I think it's one that most people can relate to, is look at a crow. A crow is a very beautiful big black bird. It's tricksterish. It has certain habits. It likes to be in certain places. It has certain ways of being in the world. I know crow very well as a physical object, as a physical bird. But when I look at crow, there's this imaginal overlay. There's this kind of otherworldly, mundus imaginalis overlay, which is that Crow in my mythology is a trickster. Crow is the Morrigan, the goddess of kind of death and rebirth, who you didn't mess with any more than you would want to mess with Crow. So I think a lot of it for me is just an acknowledgement that you're seeing kind of beyond the physical. And again, the physical is very important. We are incarnated physical beings. But nevertheless, there's a depth, there's a layered depth to the way that you see it. And I think if you look at Crow like that, then you are in a sense seeing into the other world. You're already giving it what it needs, which is acknowledgement. And I think relationship for me is the word that I would use. What the other world
Hmm.
asks of us, I think, is relationship. And I've often thought that when you're doing that kind of thing, when you're kind of when you're seeing beyond the physical into the kind of mythic, into the imaginal, you're also feeding the world soul. Plato had this wonderful idea of the anima mundi, the kind of world soul, to which we all belonged and fed into. And it's just like that we're keeping it alive by acknowledging it and by working with it in whatever way that we do, even if it's simply waking up in the morning and taking our dreams seriously.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess when I said ritual, like behind that is my understanding of ritual that it is, I call them like little rituals actually, because to kind of take the grandiosity out of them. So like when we first moved to this land, I was like trying to figure out like, well, how do I like kind of introduce myself to this place so that I can better belong here? Like, how do I make a connection to this place? And I was sitting with this question, and I had a dream. That I should feed the spirits of the land, and the spirits of the land were the birds. So simply like go out, get some bird seed. We have a little ledge out this window, and so I started putting bird seed out, and it was amazing because it was like inviting all of these beings of the land to this place where I do my practice and everything. I can look out and see all the different varieties of birds, and the squirrels come and the rabbits come. So it's a simple thing like that when I'm talking about ritual, it's like the little
Absolutely.
things, the
Absolutely.
acknowledgement, like you said, and the appreciation.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed.
And I guess that's an example of like taking your dreams seriously, right?
Kind of. I mean, it really, there are lots of ways to do it, aren't there? So part of it can be interaction with the things that we inhabit the world alongside, whether it be a tree or a rock or a bird. It can be just like seeing through the physical into whatever else they represent in the same way that are messages. Dreams are trying to tell us something, just like that crow outside of my window is trying to tell me something, apart from the fact that it just wants to squawk at me. So yeah, I think there are lots and lots of different ways in. But for me, I think the problem that we face, or that we have faced in the West for a very, very long time, is that the imaginal has become in our heads. We've
Hmm.
taken it away from the physical. And I suppose what my passion is about is bringing that imaginal back, literally back to earth, literally back to the ground under our feet, so that, okay, we can work with our dreams and we can work with, whatever journeying practices or other practices we might have. But really, it's the crow that is the physical incarnation, just as we are physical incarnations, that we also have somehow to be able to work with.
Hmm.
The
So just
land,
as
yeah.
mhm. Yeah, just as like we see that imaginal overlay when we look at the crow or the oak tree, like we see the kind of stories at the
Yeah.
same time as we see that individual being, whether it's a tree or a bird or whoever, right? And so if we start to look at our own story that way, like as a story with meaning, and we get curious about the meaning of our life, we're also kind of cultivating our own mythopoetic identity, to use a Bill Plotkin term. Do you say that's accurate?
I do. I think the trick that most people find very, very difficult is to see themselves the way that they see a crow. Yeah, I do.
Hmm.
And I think you have to take it beyond the books that want you to, pick your archetype. Are you Athena? Are you Artemis? Are you Hera? It has to go beyond that. And it has to be
Hmm.
just like stepping back. And one of the ways that I do it is really by asking a bunch of really weird questions. So, for example, I know what the crow is in my mythology, but what am I in the mythology of a crow? What might I look like? My place in the world. If the crow
Hmm.
looks at me, what does the crow see? And that's not kind of supposing that a crow clearly will think in the same way that a human does, but it's an interesting kind of reversal of position that I think is a really good practice often. That we tend to have questions that are all about us, and that irritates me. We have to have questions about who we are in in the wider world of other beings that have a function on this planet just like we do.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that move of wondering like who we are in the crow's story.
Yeah. Yeah. And
That's
who do we
great.
want to be,
Yeah,
Do
right.
we
Like,
want to be the plunderer or do we want to be the caretaker, for example?
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. What are some of the other weird questions you ask?
Well, there you go. Now you're asking me on the spot and I can't think of any. It'll have to come in the course of conversation.
Okay,
I
I
like that.
see.
I like those kind of reversals of point of view, I suppose. I started life or this kind of work as a novelist, as a
Hmm.
writer of novels before I kind of got into the work that I do now and books like Haggerty. And point of view is a really very important aspect of a book. Who's doing the talking, to whom, and in what context? So that's just always been a really big thing for me.
Hmm. Well, coming back to fairy tales, I guess when I look at fairy tales, what I see is the protagonists are usually young girls or young boys. And if there's an older male in the story, he's usually kind of peripheral to the main storyline. Like he's the bad king, or he's uh, I don't know, the hunter who comes along and maybe instigates something. But in terms of like finding fairy tales that speak to me as a over middle-aged man, uh, it's impossible. And I have a real problem with like identifying with the kind of the young hero of the stories. So what do you do in that case where it's hard to find like a middle-aged or old man in these stories who is kind of like central and is really involved in the story?
Well, I don't think it's about centrality. And when I
Hmm.
wrote Haggitude, and then I have another book coming along the same lines in October, Wise Women, which is also a big collection of older women in European myth and folklore. I did a 5-year research project looking for those stories because they're not central. But sometimes they are. Actually, there are some older women who, in some folk tales and fairy tales, who are absolutely the key characters, sometimes the only character. But mostly people say, oh, they're just doing a bit part. But they're not. What they're doing is actually their bit part is the bit that kind of that sets off the story, or for the heroine or hero, that shows them what they must do in order to make their story a beautiful and good one. So they're immensely powerful, older women who appear to be bit parts, but when you look at them and you look at the cluster of such characters, something really remarkable um, emerges, which is older women having the power and the wisdom, the recognition, which allows them to kind of pull the strings of the story. I would be very surprised if it wasn't something similar for men. I don't really see that as my job. It's kind of something I've played with because I've got a lot of experience at kind of interpreting fairy tales and analyzing fairy tales from that 5-year research project, but it's not something I wouldn't know what to do with the characters if I found them because I'm not a man. And, we there are different ways of being in the world. And um, I'm not also so passionate about finding the stories, but I bet you if somebody did that research project, you would find a similar thing. On the other hand, having said that, I will say that there is a theory out there amongst very tiny number of academic folklorists that have ever written about this that suggests that there aren't very many older men, as you say, in the same way that there are many older women. Now, I don't know. I just don't know. And it's easy to say that, but somebody's got to do the research project to make it go. I can think, for example, I mean, Arthur, King Arthur eventually, by the time he got to the end of his life, was an older man. Merlin was for sure an older man. We have all kinds of wild men and trickster men and, all kinds of men in European myth and folklore that are really kind of interesting. And so I think we have a focus too much these days on who is the main character. And when you're older, I don't think it's about being the main character in the
Hmm.
same. I think it's about how do you serve? How do you serve? What's the point of you? What are you for? What are you going to do to help the world in its process of becoming? Because you've had a lot of your own becoming by then. It's not that you haven't got still some to do. But I think that's maybe one of the errors that we make. And that's a very
Hmm.
heroic approach to story, isn't it? Who's the main character? And
Yeah.
part of our problems is that we have focused on the hero archetype for very, very much too long. What about the other archetypes? What about the smith, who's incredibly magical? What about the magician? What about all of these other characters? I don't know any men, literally no men, that I have ever met and known are fitted to be the hero. That's not an archetype they want to be, are suited for, and yet all of our stories are about the hero.
Hmm. That's remarkable. You must be meeting different men than I'm meeting because,
Really? I guess
yeah,
possibly I might be. Yeah, it's entirely feasible. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think it's quite common that men who are starting, this kind of midlife passage, looking for more meaning in their life, they start to maybe look at some stories, or they go online and they get into Joseph Campbell or these kind of like pop psychology videos about the archetypes, and they're given all these heroic kind of archetypes, whether it's the king or the valiant warrior, and that's what they're finding, and so that's what they're identifying with. And I think, like, personally, that's a bit of a mistake. I see the heroic archetype as something that belongs in the first half of life. I'm only speaking for male psychology here because I don't really understand women's psychology.
Who does?
Um,
We don't. So why should you? I do
and
take your point, Brian, and I
mm,
didn't mean to suggest. I meant to suggest exactly what you're saying. That's the archetype they're driven to. But most men are not suited to it. They're not suited to be the swashbuckling, individualistic. I'm going to save the world. Bring something back that effectively saves the world. It's not who most men are, and I think that the hero archetype has been more damaging for men or as damaging for men as it has been for women who have no role in that other as a kind of conquest or whatever.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Yeah, well, what I was getting to is I like what you said about it not being about centrality. And so that changes things in midlife. If we don't expect ourselves to be front and center, but somehow on the periphery, like the blacksmith who takes the younger person under his wing, teaches him a trade, but it's not really about him. He's a catalyst for something else that's happening like in the world or with a person. And I think that's like a more, it feels like a more appropriate role for older men to be taking.
For sure,
Um,
for sure. I mean,
yeah.
it's something, I've written a lot about the what I call the post-heroic journey. I didn't coin the phrase. It was actually a man who coined it, Alan Sheenan. Have you interviewed him or have I imagined that?
Yeah, no, I tracked
Okay.
down Alan.
Oh,
He's
I have,
great.
yeah. So I think he was the one who possibly coined that, and I kind of adopted that a good few years ago, and have worked with it a lot from both a psychological and a mythological perspective to say, okay, what is the post-heroic journey? Because the books, at least that I have read of his, really important in pointing it out, but don't really develop it. And what's interesting to me, very interesting to me, is if you do go back and you look at our old folk tales and our old legends, and call them myths if you like, but I would say the legends. If you
Legends,
look at the
right?
Grail myth, it's not really a myth; it's more a romance. But we can argue about terminology. I just have to say that. The Grail mythology is often characterized and was characterized in many ways by Campbell as heroic. Young knight conquers all and gains the Grail. What everybody wants, the Holy Grail. If you look at the story, it doesn't happen quite that way because Percival, who's the normal young knight in these stories, does not attain the Grail by all of the battles that he has fought and won and all of the knights that he has slaughtered. He attains the Grail by asking the compassionate question, "What ails thee?" Finally, he gets it, and he realizes that that question of the wounded Fisher King is all that's required to heal the wasteland and for him to become the Grail King. That's not heroic in the sense that Campbell was mostly talking about. I consider that to be post-heroic. Actually, it was pre-heroic, because it's very old. There are stories all over Britain about and Ireland about a cow that in Irish is called the Glasgavlin, the cow of plenty, where this cow just like has milk for anybody who needs it, and anyone can go to the cow and take a bucket of milk until one day someone comes along with a sieve and a bunch of buckets, and because the cow can't feel the bucket being filled up, this person takes bucket after bucket of bucket. The cow figures out what's going on, buggers off, never seen again. End of the cow of plenty. So there are
Mm.
stories about not taking too much. There are stories about compassion. There are stories, I won't go on and on with examples, but there's stories about community and not individualism is what actually saves the day. You particularly, and it won't surprise you, find that community um, focus in fairy tales where there is a heroine and not a hero. Heroine never wins through just on her own resources. She has a lot of them often, but it's always with the help of, hungry mice that she gives some of her porridge to, even though she's starving, and then they help her to sort the seeds from the grain. So we had stories way, way before Joseph Campbell was born that were not heroic, actually. They were focusing on completely different values and values that we need today in a planet that we have pretty much overrun, I think. So stories are really, really great for that.
Mm. I've been thinking that uh, stories are becoming endangered. Like good stories, stories that speak to the soul, are like an endangered species now. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, people's attention spans are dwindling. People are reading less. Um, and I think like a lot of parents are actually terrified to read, like they're so terrified of traumatizing their children that they avoid reading them stories that might be upsetting to the child. And I remember reading Bruno Bettelheim's Uses of Enchantment, and he makes a really strong case for fairy stories at a young age to help the child develop psychologically and to become more resilient. And I was thinking about like stories as a kind of way to inoculate a child against the traumas of the world. Just like when you have a child, it's really important that they get in the dirt, that they make contact with a bunch of different animals. This helps to build their immune system. And you have to do it at the very early stage of life. You can't kind of do it later on. I found that out through having problems with my own allergies. I couldn't kind of get that initial inoculation later on. It had to happen early. And so I think like giving children like a diversity of stories maybe acts in the same way, but in a psychological fashion. I mean, what do you think about my little theory?
It's not bad. It's like a kind of psychological immunity that you're giving them. I think,
Yeah.
when I was a kid in a very troubled childhood and very poor, impoverished childhood, fairy tales, the kids in fairy tales were kids like me, you know? They had a home that wasn't safe for whatever reason it might be. And what those stories did was more than anything, they helped me understand that no matter how appalling the situation that you begin with, there is always a way to transform that situation. And that, kind of circling back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that is why they're still very powerful for adults because I don't like the word problem solving. A lot of people say that fairy tales are about problem solving. They're not about problem solving. They're about imagining. They're about imagining different endings. It looks like this story is only going to end in one way and it's going to be bad. Bullshit. You read the fairy tale and it will tell you how it might be possible to transform that story. Now, fairy tales are very simple stories. They're supposed to be. And in a sense, that's their beauty, not their flaw, because that's why the images and the characters stay with us because they're so big in a plot that's, fairly simple and not very much characterization. And really, it's all about, I think psychological kind of immunity is an interesting way of putting it. It's all about developing beliefs and resources and using your imagination because the way that those kids and young people in fairy tales find their way out is rarely obvious. It always requires some leap of the imagination,
Hmm.
as well as the help.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's true. Like they find their way out of the situations using a kind of a cleverness, trickery, kind of joining forces with like non-human beings, and yeah, the imagination, like to be able to like have a tree talk to you and tell you which way to go in the forest or something like that.
I mean, the bravery is all because of the help that they receive.
Mm,
They're kind of emboldened by the fact that an old woman or an old man or a tree has kind of shown them the way. And that's such a really important lesson to learn. And this whole business of sanitizing fairy tales makes them pointless. The whole point is
hmm
that kids are in impossible situations. And look at the world. Kids are in impossible situations. So what are we going to do? Just present them with stories that are nice, the kind of what we always call them. When I was a kid, the John and Jane books, which we had at school, which were stories about a little boy and a little girl who lived with a perfect mummy and a perfect daddy in a perfect middle class house, and everything was nice. And mummy gave them to, and it's just like my life was nothing like that. And that was not, they were not helpful to me because all they showed me was that I wasn't a proper child. They were proper children. I wasn't. Whereas fairy tales, which I read when I went home from school, were absolutely about kids like me. And that's so very fine. And it's true when we're adults as well. We're still those kids. We're still the kids who had a difficult childhood, who had a mother wound, a father wound, whatever it might be.
hmm. Well, there's something, I mean, the fairy tales can be really scary. Like, I remember when I was a little kid, there was a witch who lived under my bed. And every night when I went to sleep, I would have to be away from the headboard, which had slats in it, because her fingers would reach up and touch my hair. And that, that kind of scared me for years. That stuck with me. And,
Yeah, but
if
then you
if
built
I had to get
resources
up,
about fear.
yeah, and when I even had to get up in the middle of the night to go pee or something, I'd have to like leap from my bed so that she wouldn't reach out from under the bed.
Everybody
Um,
has monsters under the bed, but on the other hand, it's just like, well, it kind of prepares you for life. There are monsters in life, you know?
yeah. Well, that's what I'm getting to. Like, what do you like? Yeah, I guess I'm interested in like how you think as a psychologist, how you think that works, and like how do kids take in these stories, and how do they, to use my word, like inoculate us toward like the future challenges of life? I mean, do you have a sense of like, is it having images to draw on in difficult or scary situations, or?
I think, I have a slightly different perspective from most people on that. I really do think it is that we see ourselves in these stories. And, the people who say, well, they're ridiculous, they're just silly, everybody lives happily ever after. Actually, everybody doesn't in all of the fairy
No.
tales. But, it's just like it's teaching kids that someone would always come along and save them. I don't think that's what it's teaching kids. I think it's teaching them that the world is full of kids in really difficult situations with really difficult adults around them. But it's not all over. And I really do think at some level, you can produce a whole bunch of psychological theories, but I really do believe at some level it is actually as simple as that. It's just you're in company, you're among friends, people like you find a way out of impossible situations. I do think it's as simple as that.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, like if Jack can do it, if Jack can escape from the angry giant, then maybe I can too.
Exactly. If the
Like using my wits, right?
sure, if and ask and taking help and building relationships in order
Right.
to help. If yeah, if the stupid youngest sister can do it, or the stupid youngest son can do it, then anybody can do it. There's a fairy tale pretty much for anybody in any situation in any country, you know.
Hmm. I mean, that is a theme in fairy tales. Like, you look and it's like the third brother, the youngest brother, is always seen as this kind of idiot, and he's the one who actually gets them out of whatever bind they're in. What is that telling us?
Well, in the stories with heroines, it's always the youngest daughter actually is always the good one. She's the goody two
Oh,
shoes in a sense. But really, that rule of three is a purely storytelling trope. It's part of the oral tradition. People expect that. There was one, and what it's doing is showing them all of the ways in which you fail in a situation. You
hmm.
fail by being lazy, you fail by not doing the work, and then you succeed by this. So it allows you to kind of rehearse. So twice is the message. Don't do it this way. Really don't do it this way. Ah, there's a way to do it.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd read somewhere that three is the kind of smallest number you need to establish a pattern.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
And you've got
so
to
you got to do.
establish the bad pattern so that people really understand this is how you screw it up. Ah, you do it this way.
Hmm.
Mm.
When you start looking at the lesser known fairy tales, especially, you realize that these aren't simply like clear moral tales. They can be so ambiguous and strange. So if they're not moral tales for children, they must have some other purpose, right? Which points toward what we've been talking about, I think, is like giving kids a kind of more diverse range of experiences to project themselves into, something like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't think there are very many answers to it. I mean, clearly some of them were moral tales and, changed through the centuries in the oral and written tradition as social customs and expectations changed, which is why we're still, reworking fairy tales today. But I think, if you look at Siberian folktales, for example, they're crazy. I mean, they are very shamanic. And so they are kind of representing something that's almost mythical, how the world is and how you get on in it. Um,
So it's
I think
reflecting their particular cosmology.
reflecting their cosmology. And I think for our folk and fairy tales, we're a long way from our original cosmology or original cosmologies, and so we don't quite see that in them. But nevertheless, there is still that sense of respecting the other world, the underworld in the Siberian tradition, and just those basic moral qualities of respect and reciprocity
Mm,
throughout. That's really what joins them all up, no matter whether they're weird or normal seeming.
mm. Yeah, that's a theme that I noticed too, that a lot of the stories have to do with like etiquette and
Mhm.
courtesy,
Yeah.
toward all the other beings, not just the mother and father, the king and the queen. But it's like the protagonist is learning like etiquette in nature or with these spiritual beings and things like that.
For sure. I mean, I've written a lot about in the context specifically of women's stories of shape shifting is it's just what you do.
Ubiquitous. Hmm.
Yeah, it's literally what you do, and I mean, and that's true in the myths as well as the fairy tales. In Ireland, for example, the Morrigan, let's just call her a crow goddess for shorthand, is as comfortable as a crow as she is in human form. There's no neither are preferable. It's just how it is. That's slipping away. And certainly with stories of women, you find this great connection with animals. The Selkie, for example, who's a seal woman, um, swan maidens everywhere. What's curious about it, just to go off at a bit of a tangent, is in these kind of stories of shape shifting. for when the women shapeshift, it's always perfectly natural. It's part of who they are. They're always going to be part seal. They're always going to be part swan. That is never going to change.
I know what you're
When the
going to say.
men,
Yeah.
yeah, when the men are doing it, it's a curse.
It's a curse.
It's a curse. They have been enchanted. A spell has been put on them and they must be disenchanted. Now, isn't that an interesting word? They must be disenchanted so that they are all and only human. And of course, that dates back to that whole split between nature and the intellect. And Plato, bless his heart, was very wonderful for lots of things, but did have this whole idea that the rational, the intellectual was superior to the natural. Men were associated with the rational, women with the natural world. There you go.
Hmm. Yeah, that's curious. It's always seen when the male is transformed. Like you said, it's a curse, it's a diminishment.
Yeah,
And the
exactly.
goal is to return him back to his true form.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas for the
And
women, that is part of their true form. Their true form is
right,
seal and human.
yeah. Now, a lot of these stories that feature this theme are like pre-Cartesian.
Sure.
So how do we, I mean, is that something that has been long thought that, men
Look at
are over
Christianity.
nature, or,
Absolutely. I mean, look at Christianity. We
right? Then
must
we're
have
talking like 2,000 years or so. Yeah.
absolutely. And pre that, I mean, Plato was pretty much, yeah, well, it's complicated with Plato, but he would
It's
have
like a
he would have argued
proto-Christian.
kind of, yeah, for sure. I mean, he influenced Christians and Islam as well. And so it's just this whole sense that it's that whole it was the development of that idea that the natural world is something kind of either sinful, in the Christian sense, in the extreme Christian sense, or just kind of like not very interesting. And it's curious, really, because if we do go back to Plato again, Plato's whole point, and Plotinus, who came after Plato in second, third century AD, the whole point was he was talking about souls choosing to be incarnated and choosing to be incarnated for what to do or to be something. With Plotinus particularly believed we actually chose our parents. We chose to come into this world, and who knows what for, in Platonic terms, to be or to do something. Hillman, who wrote his wonderful book, The Soul's Code, based on those old ideas, would have said possibly in order to express a unique way of being human, to express the various possibilities, good or bad, of being human in this world. And so, yeah, I mean, it hasn't always been bad.
Hmm. I wanted to talk to you about Plato's myth of Ur. You mentioned it in a recent Substack that you wrote on faith and not losing it. And I was thinking about the role that stories play in our lives now and the importance of having a kind of myth to live by to make meaning of the suffering of life and the challenges of life. Um, you know, when I came across Plato's myth, I was I don't know, in my 30s maybe, reading the Soul's Code. But when I was a kid, I had an intuition, trying to make sense of the difficulty of my life. I just had this intuition that I chose to be born to this family in order to learn something. And that got me through some really tough times. And let me tell you, I was not exposed to Plato when
No,
I was a kid, let alone James Hillman or Carl Jung or Joseph
neither. Yeah.
Campbell. And so when I finally read the Soul's Code, I was like struck by it. I said, "Oh my God!" Like I wasn't just a silly kid trying to get through a hard time. There's something, so that's one of the myths that I've lived by that gives my life meaning. That I keep coming back to. It makes so much sense to me.
Mhm.
And so you talked about that myth as well.
I
And I
wrote
wonder,
about, yeah, for ages, years and years and years in the Enchanted Life. I first probably wrote about it in 2018. Yeah, I mean, it's something also that made sense to me as a child, and I couldn't have expressed it in that way. But as difficult as my childhood was, and there was never a sense, kids coming from this incredibly poor background in the northeast of England. It's like, as bad as it can get. You were never going to go anywhere. It was just all going to be bad. But I had a really very strong sense, and it's not of purpose, but of just like, no, I'm here. And it's not even self-worth. It's just a sense that I'm here and I'm here I'm going to call it for a reason because I can't put words around it. And when I was older, as I grew older, it was always a very strong feeling to me that I was not here um, just for a ride. I was not here just to have fun. I was here to be or to do something, and I'd better get my act together and make sure that I wouldn't necessarily have known what it was, but a really strong sense of I want to call it responsibility, you know?
I was going to
It's
say
not a free
obligation.
ride. Yeah. Kind of, yeah. And I think that's very, very wonderful. I do think for me, there are two aspects of calling, as Hillman called it, calling. Two aspects of it. One is I believe that we are here in service to the world in whatever way we might have a gift to give to the world. It's, what seems to be small or what seems to be big. But I do believe that we're also here for our own soul growth. And I think for a lot of us who have a heavily developed sense of responsibility, it's kind of like you tend to forget that's like all in service. We're also here to learn and to grow ourselves. And I think for me, it's about keeping those two things in balance, which isn't
Hmm.
always easy either.
Hmm. That's great. Um, like one of the ways I think about religion is that it gives people stories to live by. It helps them to understand themselves in a context of something bigger. Now, if religion has I don't know the right way to put it, I don't want to offend anyone, but if religion is not working for people anymore for whatever reason, um, like I could never quite take it on. Was always wrestled with Christianity. I went to Catholic high school because they had a great music program, and I went to religion class and all that stuff, and went to mass. Um, and there's something I found attractive about it, kind of a spiritual orientation. A big part of that school was being of service, so that's where I learned the value of volunteering, um, taking care of kids with Down syndrome and things like that. So it taught me a lot, but I could never totally take on the religion itself. And it wasn't until later that I figured out, for myself why. And so I guess what I'm getting to is like, if religion isn't working for people, do you think like mythology and working with, I call it soul work, so working with dreams, working with stories, do you think that that can take the place of religion?
Kind of. I mean, I think, the problem with religions, and there are very many ways to be a Christian, okay? There are very many
Yeah.
ways to be religious, but the standard way, let's call it that, actually, you say that it gives you a story to live by, and of course it does, but in another way, it takes your story away from you because it relieves you of responsibility. All you have to do is, like, go to church on a Sunday, say three Hail Marys if you're a Catholic Christian, and then it'll all be all right, and so I think it relieves people of responsibility for their own fate, which I feel they would say is arrogant. I feel we're not here for a free ride and just to, go to church on a Sunday and then it'll all be all right. I think we need to be better than that. And so I think, so from my own perspective, I mean, I went through a Christian phase when I was like 13, like I think most girls seem to. Um, and then I've never been comfortable with any of the major religions, just not any of them, whether we're talking about Buddhism or whether we're talking about something more organized like Christianity. And my own belief system very much dates back to Plato. Okay, so I believe that I am here to do or to be something, to grow as a soul and to give service to the world, and that's all I need to believe in. Is that's as much meaning as I can take in my life. And then, really, that's kind of a lot, isn't it? And
Yeah.
so I don't need to know the details because we'll never know. We will never know. Okay. We can believe and we can write books and we'll never know. And I'm very comfortable with uncertainty. As I've got
Mhm.
older, uncertainty is my best friend. Okay. Really, I like not knowing. I like not to have to be definitive and have it all straight. I like just that sense that I am here for something and, I'd love to know all the answers. I'm not going to be able to. So that for me is meaning. Now, in doing that, in recognizing that, if I recognize that there is perhaps such a thing as a soul that comes here, then I want to work with soul. I want to do that soul work that you're talking about. I want to be able to kind of feed myself from the imaginal world, from the world of soul. I want to work with dreams. I want to listen to the messages. If I draw three cards, the same three cards in a row from a tarot deck, there's something there that I need to pay attention to. So I like that idea of just that. Plato had this concept, which Hillman picked up on, that we all, when we come into this world, having chosen our path, let's say, we drink the waters of the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and we come in not knowing a thing. thanks very much. That's great. But the whole point of the journey is to figure it out. And he said that every soul comes into this world with what the Greeks called a daemon. You know, Hillman, nobody knows what that is. It's been interpreted as variously as a guardian angel or just an image. Hillman called it an image, just some sense of what it is that you are at
Right.
heart.
And his
So
image was the acorn and the oak
he called
tree.
it an
Like the
acorn,
image
which
of the
is
oak trees in
essential.
the oak in the acorn,
Yeah,
right?
it was just some sense of who you are
Hmm.
at heart. If you stripped everything else away from you, what is that? Some kind of image, and it's, of course, it's not something that you necessarily picture, but there are lots of ways of holding an image. So that to me is really important. Anything that can help me figure out what I'm here for, why I'm here, is going to be a good thing.
Hmm. Yeah, that image, I've come to think of it as like a form, and that the more that we follow like our soul's urgings, the more we fill out that form. And so it's not a matter like Hillman would talk about soul making. There's some ideas around like growing your soul, but for me, it's become like more about fulfilling this form.
Mhm.
And so we talk about being fulfilled in life. Well, there's the correlation. The more we follow our soul's path and its urgings, the
That
more we
is soul
feel
making.
fulfilled.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Where do I want to go from here? I mean, we may have said enough.
We may have said enough. We've been going for about an
I,
hour.
yeah, I feel like
Yeah,
there's a
we've covered
natural
some very
ending here.
serious ground. Yeah, some very serious
Yeah.
ground.
Is there anything that you want to say about, well, I guess the course you're doing at Pacifica, I've heard that it's full. So
It's
even if people are intrigued by it,
it's
sorry.
tough. Exactly this time around. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It filled up very, very quickly. I'll do it again in
Mm,
whatever form, either at Pacifica or separately. But really, it is about the point of that is that these techniques that we're talking about, working with fairy tales. They're really very important. Anybody can do it for their own kind of personal growth, and I try to provide a map in other courses that I run of how you can work with fairy tales to kind of illuminate your own journey through life. But certainly for therapists and for people who are working in any way therapeutically in any modality, they really give you something to hang an idea on, to explore with people and to tap into that remarkable power of the image and the archetype. So to me, it's really, really important work. And I've been doing it for 20 years, but I seem to be cycling back around to it in a really kind of very focused way at the moment because I think it cuts across cultures, it cuts across because fairy tales are pretty much the same, apart from the clothes
hmm.
people wear. Cuts across cultures, it cuts across belief systems. It's just well, they're archetypal, in a
Yeah.
sense.
I got
Yeah.
this thing I just started saying where it's like, when we start to notice these correlations between different mythologies and religious images and all that, I just go, it's all archetypal, baby. Like it just
There you
is.
go. It is.
Um, and it's one of the things you find when you start to study fairy tales is that they've been categorized as types, like
Mhm.
a type 332 about oh, I was just looking up one. It was Godfather Death. And
Oh,
I don't know
yeah.
if you know,
I
such
know
a
it very well.
strange,
It's a
oh,
strange story, but you know why? Sorry, I'm
I
just going
wanted
to
to
interrupt you
ask
for
you
a
about
second.
it because I've just
Yeah.
encountered it and I'm like sitting with it the past couple days and going, God, I wonder if because it seems kind of obscure. I've never come across it before until
It's a
something led
Grimm
me there.
story. Yeah, it's a Grimm story, and I don't know that I've seen it very much elsewhere. So this is basically a story, just very, very briefly, about a man, a very poor man who has a child, and no one will stand for his child. So if anything happened to him, the child would have no godparent to kind of take care of it. So he decides that he's going to go out, and the first person that he meets, he's going to say, "Will you be godfather or godmother to my child?" And he meets Death. Walking along the road as you do, and Death says, "Oh, I'll be, godfather to your child." But Death is very, very cruel in that story, So he gives the father a gift of being a physician, so he can heal anybody, except if Death is standing. I can't remember whether it's at the foot of the bed or the head of the bed.
The
And if
head of
Death
the
is
bed.
standing at the head of the bed, he must not heal that person because that person is going to die. Well, the physician, as people do, decides to try to trick Death by turning the bed around so that Death is now at the foot of the bed. And Death punishes the physician in the Grimm's version of this story. There is, in my next book, Wise Women, out in October, you will find the story from Moravia, I think, of Godmother Death. Godmother Death is a completely different kettle of fish. She does not punish, she explains. And in
Hmm.
the end, the father and his son, who has also been given the gift of vision, just die in Godmother Death's arms. So it's not that she's not a serious woman. She explains that death is death and what have you, but a completely different perspective from the godmother and the godfather Death.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Well, it is one of those stories. There are variations from
Sure.
all over. Yeah. And they're very strange. I'm going to continue to sit with it and try to understand what why it is and why it propagated so much because there's something to it and it's not like a clear moral lesson. I mean,
It's
there
not.
kind of is. Like don't try to cheat death is
Well, I think it comes from all those ideas of death as the grim reaper. I mean, not all folk tales are wise. Let's remember that. Death is a grim reaper who will strike you down in the prime of your life, and that's what people thought when pretty much everybody back in the day died young. And nobody really got to live to old age. But so I
mm,
don't think we necessarily have to think that they're all wise or all great. But there are very few. It's unfortunate because there are very few in European folklore. There are very few personifications of death. We have harbingers of death in the Irish tradition, the banshee and what have you. We don't have very many actual deaths. And the one that we do have that's male is really a bit of he's just a bit of an arse, if I can.
Well, in some of the variations of the story, actually, the child goes out and the first old man he encounters is God. And he says, "Well, you're not really fair because you give some people all the wealth and other people nothing." And then he meets the devil, and he says, "Well, you're just up to all this trickery, and I can't trust you." And then he meets Death and chooses Death as the
Everyone
Godfather
the same.
because
Yeah.
treats everyone the same and it's the most fair. And yeah, then he makes the deal with Death about being a healer and he goes to the bedside of a beautiful girl who's dying and he sees Death at the head of the bed and so he
That kind of
must
thing. Yeah.
let her die and not heal her and he doesn't. And but he ends up Death doesn't let him get away with it. And there's all these variations on how it ends, but that's the basic story is don't cheat Death. And there's a hard lesson there about I guess letting people that you love or long for let them pass or something. But very very strange, and not one I encountered as a kid. I mean, we were so saturated with fairy tales when I was a child, like not only the little storybooks with the kind of classic fairy tales, but I was remembering that even the cartoons that we watched were often reenactments of the fairy tales and like pretty true to form. Like some
Mm.
of those old kind of Looney Tunes cartoons, they weren't the sanitized, Disneyfied versions of the fairy tales. And so again, like I wonder, like, what do you think we're missing when we're missing those kind of stories, like in the culture? Or do you think that the culture is producing
No,
new
I
fairy
don't.
tale-like stories? No.
No, I don't. I mean, I think sometimes they are. I mean, if I look at Angela Carter, for example, British reteller of fairy tales, who kind of, I'm going to exaggerate, but sort of invented the feminist retelling of the fairy tales, then I can see that that is a tradition that is genuine. I mean, don't forget that all of these back in the day would have been in the oral tradition, and the oral tradition changed. It changed from teller
Hmm.
to teller in the same time period, and it changed over time periods because the folk changed and it was the folks' tales. So we mustn't, the mistake that I think we make is we rob these stories of their life by writing them down and saying that's the true story. Kind of like the Bible. It's just like that's it and it must never change again. That's not what fairy tales are for. So when you find some people who are changing the stories or who are letting the stories develop for a changed world. That's really important. And I wrote a collection of reimagined fairy tales, Foxfire, Wolfskin, and other stories of shape-shifting women. And in it, I looked at the Snow Queen and thought, well, in a world of global warming, the Snow Queen, is she a heroine? Could she be a heroine? So that kind of questioning of the same kind of characters, the same images, the same themes, but for a changed world, I think is really important. But I
Mm.
think we don't have very many people who have the breadth of vision to do that. And so what we see are kind of, Disney is the classic. The Disneyfied fairy tale is death to the fairy tale. And I think we have too many people who really don't take it seriously enough, who want to take out all of the blood and gore and the nasty stuff, or who want to make the heroine go on a hero's journey, just like the prince, except she happens to be a woman. So I think there's a lot of trash out there, but there's also a lot of heart, and I think it's just about finding the discernment to be able to tell the difference.
Mm. Here's something to get your take on. Do you think, I mean, I feel it is, but do you feel like Lord of the Rings is like one of the few true modern stories that acts in the way a myth does, that it's really archetypal and not in a kind of overtly intentional way like Star Wars?
Well, he was an expert in Anglo-Saxon and Norse kind of mythology. So I mean, he drew on that very, 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 very deeply, and brought into it concerns around the Second World War and concerns around even then the vanishing English countryside. So yes, I think it's a very true way of carrying the fairy tales forward.
Hmm. Well, and it's very, it's not simplistic. Like it's not a simplistic hero's journey like Luke Skywalker's journey. It's one of the things I appreciated about it is that it has a lot of like archetypal richness to it.
Very complex, exactly. And that, if the fairy tales are designed to be very simple because the power of the story isn't in where the heroine lived and what curtains she had at the windows. They're about the archetypal characters and the images, and they had to be simple because they had to be told in the oral tradition, not by bards who were used to learning by rote lots and lots of lines, but by your average village storyteller. So they were always supposed to be simple. But some of the most successful retellings or reimaginings are the ones that take the bones of that story and pile on um, the character and the
Oh,
detail
like flesh it out.
of everyday life. Yeah, so we can really actually see it perhaps properly for the first time.
Mm. So you appreciate when people do that?
I do, as long as they don't oversimplify the story, as long as they don't try to make it, something that it's not.
Right, like or change it in some way, like,
Well,
making the
changing
girl
it is
go on the
okay.
hero's journey or
Yeah, I mean, it's just like that's not a change, that's not real. The whole point of these stories is that they've taken thousands of years, certainly hundreds of years, to get their wisdom. It's like, a 2-year-old child is not going to have the wisdom for the world. A 2-year-old story isn't. They've got to grow and they've got to breathe and they've got to be worked on and they've got to work on people and they've got to change in organic and truthful, authentic ways rather than just be made up. Nothing wrong with made up. I'm a novelist too, but we're talking about a different kind of category here. I think they have to have the time and they have to have the space to really show themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess something, from what I've heard about Tolkien's process is that it seemed like he was really channeling something from the Mundus Imaginalis. Like it was coming through him and kind of filtered through, like maybe like the story chose him because he had prepared himself by being so immersed in folk tales and that kind of thing,
And
and
and fighting in the
language and
and fighting in the war, actually, as well. Pretty much to the point. Yes, who knows? Possibly. Yeah.
yeah, but speaking as a novelist, I mean, I was talking to someone just yesterday about the joys of reading. She's a woman in her 60s, and she was showing me a picture of her mom, who's at one of the care homes close by. And so her mom's 91, and I was asking her like, what does she enjoy doing at this stage in her life? And she says, well, she doesn't really go for all the kind of the bingo games and all that stuff. Still reads a book a week, and she loves to tend to her garden. I said, what kind of books does she read? And so we talking about her mom's like lifelong love of books and then how that got passed on to her daughter. And I was saying like how much I've enjoyed being a lifelong reader. Um, but I gotta tell you, I was reflecting on it. I realized I don't meet any men who have that same kind of joy of reading fiction
Mm.
that I've had my whole life. But I always meet women who are like, loving the next kind of fantasy series or whatever it is. And I wonder, like, do you notice this as well? And like, I really feel like men are kind of famished for good, nourishing stories.
I think it's not just anecdotal. I think, if you look at stats from the publishing industry, it's mostly women who buy books, and certainly women who buy fiction, and women who buy fiction by men, whereas men almost never buy fiction by women. So I think men buy more non-fiction. I'm sure that there must be lots of closet readers out there, but who just perhaps don't talk about it so much, whereas women are much more used to talking about creativity and the imagination amongst themselves, and it's seen to be okay in women, whereas I think for men it's a little bit less so, which is stupid when you think of how many ridiculously clever and loved male authors there are in the world. Something here just doesn't add up.
Mm. Yeah, there might be something to that because to reveal what you're reading, like a fictional book, not a self-help book, which mostly is what men are reading, I think, books on stoicism or whatever. But when you reveal like a story that you're loving, it reveals something about you. And so
Mm.
maybe that a lot of men feel that's too vulnerable,
Mm.
that's something to be hidden. I never
Maybe.
really thought about that before. Yeah. Hmm. Well, Sharon, you're known for working with women's stories, and you've been very clear about that. And I appreciate that. I don't often like it when women get into kind of the men's work world and men's stories. Just like I don't want to go into women's stories and all that. I just cannot understand it in the same way I can men's stories. So I kind of stick to my lane that way, and I appreciate that you do too. You've been a good model for that. Um, but so your courses are open to everyone.
I always, they are, but I always work with women's stories because partly
Okay.
because that's who I am. I mean, the main reason, really, the main reason, I suppose, there are many, but the main reason why I don't work with men's stories is I am tired. I am tired as tired can be of men telling women's stories and telling us how to be over the
Yeah.
centuries and still today. And if a male storyteller tells a woman's story, then it rankles because, what do you know? You've caused most of the problems that we face. Sorry, that's an
Yeah.
exaggerated response, but that's how it is. I'm not going to be that to men. On the other hand, what's interesting to me is that I do find a surprising number of men who read my books and email and comment, or who are on my Substack, who are kind of for two reasons. I think part of it is that they're interested in how women see the world because they see something that they would like, um, and they're just trying to find their way in a world in which there are a lot of women, in which it's very clear that in some ways women are trying to get it together. They know where they want to go to, but men don't anymore because that old way of being a man is just like it's very clearly defunct now. But nobody has a
Mm.
good model to say, okay, we could do this instead. Which is why I think, circling back again, getting away from the hero and looking at all of the other ways to be a man, all of the other male archetypes is really part of it. So yeah, I think I
Mm.
will always be open to any man who wants to come and talk about these stories and very often get a really interesting perspective.
Well, I noticed on your Substack when you did that post, it said, "What about the men?" And you addressed this question that you often get, like, "What about the men's stories? And could you do some men's stories and that?" And I mean, the response was incredible. You had
Nice.
a lot of men in there jumping in, and there does seem to be a dearth of good men's stories, like that answer questions on like how we can be good men in the world today and things like
For
that.
sure. And as I said at the beginning of that Substack post, that what's very fascinating is that if you look at the world of academic folklore, which I'm, very much a part of as well, and academic analysis of fairy tales, there are a gazillion feminist analyses of folk tales and fairy tales, looking at women in fairy tales, and nobody's doing that for men. Very, very few. Really, very, very few. Now, you could argue, and it has been argued, that that's because the male way of being in a fairy tale is the normal. So you don't have to look at the normal, you have to look at the abnormal, which is the woman's way. But I don't buy that. I think there are lots and lots of ways of being a man in fairy tales, lots and lots of different ways. And to focus just on the hero, again, just in case anybody hasn't got the idea, I think that's a bad thing.
We're over the
Is really
hero.
kind of, yeah, we're over here. I think that's just like that's part of the problem. So there's a lot of work to be done for men. I am an academic to begin with. I write not for the academic. I write fiction. I write kind of in a poetic sense, but I always feel it's important to know what you're talking about, and so you need to start with some really good analyses of these folktales and these fairy tales, kind of archetypal analyses and other analyses, and then just see where they go.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's telling that, like you mentioned, Alan Chinen before, who wrote a book on, kind of the what's after the hero back in the 90s. One of the very few. And I think it's important to note that he's a gay man. And so he had a different perspective than the kind of heteronormative
Right.
perspective.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
he talked a lot about the trickster and the older male mentor, and these kind of things that I think, like, homosexual men can appreciate, shape shifting and things like that. They understand that more, they're more accepting of it, they
Mhm.
value it more. But yeah, one of the things that I wish, well, I don't wish. I mean, he's like a medical psychiatrist, right? And so he didn't do like a kind of archetypal analysis of the stories. He did the research and presented stories that told a kind of different story than the typical heroic story. But yeah, I think there's just some work to be done on men's stories, beyond what Robert Bly did with Iron John, and a little bit Jack and the Beanstalk in his Sibling Society book. Um, so
I do
yeah,
think,
there's.
yeah,
Mhm,
there is a lot of work to be done. I mean, just to say that one of the things that I find very important, and I know that lots of people don't agree, but I do find it very important also to look at stories from my own tradition because I understand them. I
mhm.
understand the culture that they came from. I'm not committing an atrocity on a story by misinterpreting, a particular image. This means that, whereas to say a Japanese person, it means something completely different. And I think, start with your own. If anybody is looking to do this work, I would absolutely advise start with your own. Don't go to Japan, don't go to Korea, don't go to African stories. They're very rich and very wonderful and very beautiful. But we need here in the West to really work on our own stories because we have absolutely diminished them. We have talked about them as entertainment for children, whereas in another culture they would be cosmology. And so I think we kind of have a responsibility to our own stories and to our own land. To where we all have ancestry, even if we don't actually live there, to really work on those stories and bring them back to life again.
Mm. Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about. It's something I've wrestled with, being a kind of dislocated European person. My people have been on North America for a couple generations now. Um, and, I've gone through phases like looking at the stories from this place. Maybe that'll help me belong better here if I know some of the stories. But honestly, and quite transparently, I cannot relate to the Native American stories in the way that when I read a fairy tale, like you said, the characters and the images grab me. It's like I almost recognize the landscape in my bones when I read those stories. Whereas here, maybe part of my dharma or my soul's journey is that I'm not going to feel like I belong here, and something about that tension is
Well,
something
look,
I'm
I mean,
meant to
yeah,
experience.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and I haven't, we've been talking for a while, and I haven't got I'm kind of running out of steam to explain
Okay.
it. But really, I think what happens is that the stories of our ancestry show us the kind of archetypal possibilities that are known to us.
Hmm.
We know that we know that there will be an old woman somewhere in the landscape. In Britain and Ireland, we have this old woman, the Cailleach, who creates and shapes the land. She tells us something about the old woman as a creator, as someone who stands up for the natural world, someone who embodies the natural world. You can find that in your place. How do you think they found the Cailleach in the first place? And so, to me, what it is all about, and again, this is a whole other conversation, long conversation. It is about being story makers and myth makers. That's how it was done in the beginning. And again, we arrive in these places and we have so lost our way mythically and the mythic imagination that we don't know how to make stories with our place. And that really, to me, is what it is all about. These other stories inform us of what is possible in a place. But it's absolutely beholden on us to go and sit in front of a tree and find out what it is, what it has to say, to listen, to pay attention, to look for the heron that looks like an old woman, to look for the crow who is a trickster in your place. You don't have to import it. You just have to let the old stories, the stories of your ancestry, and perhaps some of the stories of the Native Americans are relevant in this um, respect as well, to just inform you of where the archetypes are. Make your own stories. That's what our ancestors did. It's
Hmm.
not rocket science in a way.
Hmm. That's great. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great to talk to you. I feel like you're one of my teachers now. I just feel such a resonance with your point of view and with I love like your kind of passion about things. You seem unafraid to speak your mind about certain things, which could be kind of touchy subjects, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thank
I
you.
think it,
That's old age. I'm kind of 62 now, and I almost died 3 years ago during the pandemic. And it's just like that focuses the mind. You haven't got time to mess about, and it's not that you have to be rude to people or definitive. I like to be
mm,
challenged and kind of, work around it. But I think there comes with elderhood, there comes a real clarity, a focus. Time is short. Let's just cut through some of the crap and just like talk about what really, really matters.
oh, I so appreciate that. It's so refreshing. So thank you so much, Sharon.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a lovely conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Okay, please take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.